welcome. It's great to be with you all this morning. It's not often I get to be the opening act for Ajit Pai. So I'm going to try and warm you guys up for him, because I'm sure he'll be a lot more interesting. But I want to, Randy, thank you and what the Free State Foundation does just in terms of the great work promoting free market policies, economic liberty when it comes to communications and technology industries in this country, and the very insightful papers that you publish, the conferences like this one that you host are incredibly important to the public debate on these issues. And I'm just glad I have the opportunity to be able to join you today and share a few of my thoughts on what we ought to be doing to advance our country's digital economy. Before policymakers can talk about which communications laws need to be updated, and you referenced that in your opening remarks, and which regulations have outlived their purpose, we first need to understand where the United States stands with respect to its communications and technology capabilities. We often hear about how the U.S. is falling behind the rest of the world, how our broadband infrastructure is mediocre, and how our communications industries are not competitive. These claims are so often repeated by pundits and advocates and even comedians that they almost become self-evident. But the question is, are the claims actually true? And the answer is no. For instance, the Free State Foundation's own Christopher Yu recently published a paper comparing the United States and Europe in many broadband metrics. Professor Yu found that the United States fared better in broadband investment, network latency, delivering advertised broadband speeds, and overall broadband usage. But where the U.S. really outshines Europe is broadband deployment. 82% of American households now have access to a high-speed broadband connection of at least 25 megabits, compared to just 54% in Europe. And when it comes to mobile broadband, the gap is even more pronounced. 27% of Europe is covered by 4G LTE services, compared to an extraordinarily high 86% here in the United States. And our lead in these metrics is all the more impressive when you take into consideration that America is geographically much larger and more rural than Europe. And I can add, some personal experience to this. I grew up in a town in South Dakota of 500 people out in the middle of the state. My father, who's 94 years old, still lives there, lives in the little house that I grew up in. When I grew up, my life began and ended at the city limits of Murdo. That was kind of the boundaries of what you knew and experienced. But my dad at 94 today is connected to the world. He is constantly forwarding me emails and texts and things that he gets from other people, and can sit there with a wireless network on his laptop at 94 years old in my hometown of 500 people in the middle of South Dakota and literally access the world. And that's what's really remarkable about what we have in this country. Now, we've got a lot of pro-regulatory advocates who claim our communications sector is dominated by monopolies and duopolies, but the evidence in the marketplace doesn't support that view either. Monopoly markets are typically characterized by a lack of investment, a lack of innovation, no new entrants, and excessive profits. Since 1996, the private sector has invested about $1.2 trillion into building and constantly upgrading our nation's communications networks, including about $60 billion annually in capital investments over the last few years. Regarding market entry, we've already seen rampant intermodal competition in the telephone and video markets, not to mention efforts by companies like Google and Dish Network, who are committed to becoming serious new broadband players. As for excessive profits for communications providers, again, there's little evidence. Former Clinton administration official Everett Ehrlich found that Fortune 500 companies, broadband companies, had an average profit margin of just 3.7%. The average profit margin for Fortune 500 internet companies who offer services on top of the broadband infrastructure, a whopping 24%. As Ehrlich points out, this sizable difference makes clear that providers of broadband connectivity are not extracting undue profits from broadband users. So why does all this matter? Well, because painting a picture of a dysfunctional communications and broadband marketplace is central to the efforts of pro-regulatory advocates who claim more government intervention into the online world is needed to fix a quote, unquote, broken system. Many of those who seek to regulate the Internet are using mistruths and hyperbole to scare both the public and policymakers into restricting economic and individual liberty. We should instead be celebrating the accomplishments of our communications, technology, and Internet industries and looking for ways to build upon this and drive further economic growth. The foundation that all of this success rests upon is our communications infrastructure particularly our broadband networks. Without robust and ubiquitous broadband, many of these innovations and business breakthroughs of the last several years would not be possible. We must ensure that our communications policy reflects the new Internet-powered world so that the potential of what rides over the top of our communications networks is fully realized. The last time Congress significantly updated our communications laws was in 1996. Back then, you had to pay for the Internet by the hour, and going online meant tying up your home phone line. There are only 100,000 websites in 1996, and Google and Wikipedia had not even been created yet. Today, there are nearly 900 million websites. The Bipartisan and Deregulatory Telecommunications Act of 1996 encouraged intermodal competition and provided a light regulatory touch for information services. Bipartisan leadership at the FCC reinforced the light touch for the Internet when implementing the law. All of this fostered an era of convergence and innovation in the communications space. Cable companies started to compete with telcos. Telcos got into the cable TV business, and everyone started offering Internet access. The Telecom Act was far from perfect, but it got the job done. Even so, it is best to view the Telecom Act as a transitional law for a transitional time, rather than as a permanent statute that will last 62 years without major revision like its predecessor, the Communications Act of 1934. The original Communications Act was designed for an era of actual communications monopolies. The Telecom Act was designed for the transitional era that took us from monopoly to competition. And now we need a new policy framework for today's converged, competitive, and Internet-powered world. This, of course, is much easier said than done. Modernizing the laws governing the communications and technology sectors is no small task, which is why I'm glad that my colleagues in the House of Representatives have already begun examining the regulation of the communications industry. It took several years for Congress to complete the Telecom Act back in the 1990s. Because of this, some people may think a Communications Act update is an impossible task in today's political environment and that Congress shouldn't even bother to try. I reject that pessimistic view. The voters didn't send us to Washington, D.C. to sit on our hands and resign ourselves to failure. They sent us here to make a difference. There's long been bipartisan consensus that our communications laws are outdated. According to my former colleague, Senator John Kerry, the Telecom Act was obsolete within 6 months of enactment because it didn't take the Internet into account. It would be a dereliction of duty if Congress did not at least explore whether and how our communications regulations can be modernized. I hope next year the Senate will follow the example set by the House to begin consideration of what a Communications Act update might look like. And any such discussion needs to begin with broadband Internet and the government's regulatory posture toward it. It's been said before by me and many others, but it bears repeating until people really understand. Title II, Common Carrier Regulations, designed nearly a century ago for a telephone monopoly, simply do not make sense in a more competitive broadband world. Now, I'm not saying that the Internet should be a lawless frontier free from any government oversight. That is the sort of straw man accusation leveled by those who want to avoid doing the hard work of justifying regulations for the Internet ecosystem. Even so, policymakers must be careful to preserve the light touch regime first implemented by the Clinton administration that has been so successful in making us the digital envy of the world. Some people, however, want to completely upset that regime and instead want to see the Internet shackled with Title II of the Communications Act. Title II is certainly not a light touch, and it certainly, with its burdensome rate regulation, property valuation, discontinuance provisions, along with many others, does not represent the light touch to which I'm referring. Traditional wireline telephony now makes up just 22% of the 443 million phone lines in America, and that rate continues to decline each year. When consumers are rapidly abandoning traditional Title II services, it makes little sense to apply Title II regulations to today's new technologies and business models. Even Google seems keen on avoiding the morass of Title II. The Internet giant has specifically chosen not to offer telephone services with its Google Fiber broadband product because it wants to avoid the regulatory burdens that come along with it. Another reason I oppose Title II reclassification is because regulating an industry as if it were a public utility monopoly is the surest way to guarantee the industry will become a monopoly. As I discussed earlier, the evidence in the marketplace makes it clear that our broadband market is dynamic and competitive, not at all like the early days of Ma Bell that Title II was intended for. Public utility regulation, traditionally, is intended to do two things: protect the public from the harms of a monopoly while simultaneously protecting the monopoly. Since the broadband market is demonstrably not a monopoly, regulating it as a public utility would only make the industry less competitive and less innovative. Or in other words, make it more like a monopoly. Neither Title II nor Section 706 of the Telecom Act are appropriate tools to regulate the Internet. The former is outdated and politically corrosive. The latter is legally untested and potentially far too broad. When Congress wrote both provisions, it never expected or intended for either to apply to a dynamic and competitive broadband marketplace. Because of this, any Internet regulations issued by the FCC based on either statute will be tied up in courts for years, thus creating more uncertainty for businesses and end users, not less. The only way to provide the certainty that ISPs, edge providers, content publishers, and end users need and want is for Congress to legislate. My colleagues and I need to roll up our sleeves and figure out how best to promote an open, competitive, and free Internet. Doing so isn't going to be easy, and it certainly would require every stakeholder to make some compromises. For the sake of the Internet and America's economic competitiveness, I'm willing to try. I'd note that the last time Congress updated the Communications Act, a South Dakotan and a Michigander also sat atop the Commerce Committee, so perhaps the stars are aligning there too. For all the attention that Title II, Section 706, and the IP transition get, we cannot lose sight of mobile communications. Everywhere you look, from the forecasts of venture capitalists and industry analysts to that shiny device that teenagers use, it is all about mobile broadband. Now, some people are going to argue that mobile broadband isn't quote-unquote real broadband, that mobile isn't an alternative to fixed. But tell that to the owners of the 188 million smartphones in this country. People aren't using the Internet stuck in one place, tethered to a single fixed broadband connection. In fact, Americans now spend more time with their mobile devices each day than they do going online with a laptop or a PC. If consumers view mobile and fixed broadband as part of the same seamless Internet experience, why should policymakers act as if mobile and fixed broadband are completely separate, distinct things? We should take our guidance from what real people are actually doing in the marketplace rather than listening to ivory tower academics or professional advocates who claim that wireless Internet access is quote-unquote second class. These are the very same people who argued that even a decade ago that wireless phones would never be an adequate substitute for landlines. Today, nearly half of Americans have proved those predictions to be short-sighted. For consumers, broadband is both fixed and mobile, both wired and wireless. Just as treating broadband like a monopoly is the surest way to get a broadband monopoly, treating mobile as an inferior form of broadband is the surest way to stifle wireless broadband. Rather than fighting the wisdom of the crowds, we should embrace it and pursue policies that make the mobile Internet experience even more powerful and robust. One of the things Congress can and must do is to continue focusing on spectrum. Mobility drives the innovation economy, and spectrum is what fuels wireless services. Without enough spectrum, the private sector will not be able to keep pace with consumer demand, which is growing exponentially. We must make it a priority to increase the availability of spectrum for commercial use, both licensed and unlicensed, as quickly as possible. The upcoming spectrum auctions at the FCC are critical steps in the right direction, and I'll be following them closely. But we need to start thinking about what's next. At this point, there are no more large blocks of unused spectrum sitting around waiting to be assigned for advanced wireless services. We've already gone after the low-hanging fruit, so we're going to need to redouble our collective efforts to free up more spectrum, as well as using current spectrum in a more efficient manner. Spectrum users, be they government agencies or private companies, like having distinct frequencies to themselves. But in the future, we're going to need these spectrum users to start getting used to living much closer to each other. Think of it in terms of row houses and condo buildings rather than sprawling, spread out suburbs. And much like real estate, they're not making any more wireless frequencies, so we're going to need to get the most possible out of the current spectrum map. One of the biggest drivers of increasing wireless traffic is video, another area that is ripe for reform. As ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee, I'm currently working with my colleague, Chairman Jay Rockefeller, on a satellite TV reauthorization bill. The House version of this bill includes a number of video reforms, including on retransmission consent negotiations and cable set-top box policy. While it's too soon to say what the final satellite TV bill will include, it seems clear that there is interest in both chambers on updating our video laws, many of which were written in 1992 as part of the Cable Act. A great deal has changed in the video market in just the past 5 years, let alone since we last passed comprehensive video legislation 22 years ago. When Congress wrote the Cable Act, it never envisioned telephone companies entering the TV space, let alone companies like Netflix, TiVo, Amazon, Apple, and YouTube, revolutionizing how people watch video. And the Supreme Court will soon hand down a decision in the Aereo case that may have wide-ranging implications for the television industry. With so much having changed in the video marketplace, now is a good time for Congress to examine our laws to determine whether they are still relevant and whether they provide the foundation for continued video innovation and consumer choice. Just like telephone service, our video laws in large part reflect a monopoly market structure that no longer exists. And as with voice services, video services are quickly becoming applications that merely ride on top of the underlying competitive broadband network infrastructure. Failing to modernize these outdated laws would be a missed opportunity. From my position on the Commerce Committee and in Republican leadership, I see every day the rewards and challenges of living through the digital revolution. The world moves so fast that it's hard for even the most technologically savvy and digitally connected person to keep up with everything. So it should be no surprise that our laws have fallen woefully behind. I can promise you that I will continue to work with my colleagues in the Senate to modernize America's digital policies because we need 21st century laws for a 21st century world. I know that our next speaker, FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai, is just as committed to this effort as I am. I'm sure he'll be able to offer a unique perspective on communications reform from being in the trenches every day at the Commission. And he just came and visited the great state of South Dakota and got to observe up close and personal many of the things that we're doing in our state. And so I'm pleased that he was willing, along with Commissioner O'Reilly, to make that trip to South Dakota, and look forward to hearing from him and to working with he and his colleagues at the Commission on policies that are good for the future of this industry and good for the economy of our country. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Randy, for the great work that the Free State Foundation does. Thanks.